And as a welcome to the show from the Faculty of Law at Victoria University, specialising in international law related to armed conflict and humanitarian law and policy. It's once again Dr. Marnie Lloydd. Marnie, thanks for joining us today.
Morena, thanks for inviting me again.
It's one of those situations, and we said before we started chatting, good to have you and excited to talk to you, and then kind of realised what we were going to talk about and went, it's not really exciting to talk to you about this because it's pretty repugnant and revolting what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. And but as you said back to me when I said that, it's a reality, and we want to talk about the reality of what's happening and get your perspective on it. So whilst we're saying that, I'm going to bring up some images right now. Some people may find that, well, every person will find these offensive. I can say some. It's not like anyone's going to find them not offensive. Obviously, they're an appropriate level of imagery that has come from a reputable news source and has been blurred out. But we are talking about a potential war crimes committed in Ukraine in a city called Bucha, where Russian soldiers have left. And I mean, I guess I say allegedly, but I don't know whether that's just me being technically absolutely accurate. But what we're being told is on the way out, Russian soldiers were indiscriminately killing people, hands and feet bound. And yeah, as you can see in those images that we were just showing in the background, horrifically as it was, bodies all over the city. So as someone who is a specialist in law, obviously words like war criminal and, I guess a breaking of the Geneva Convention, which we talked about last time we had you on, are things that are being put out there. So I guess the first thing is just to open the floor to you and get your thoughts around what you've seen happening, and I guess from your perspective, when you look at it from your law and lawyering point of view, what you think.
Yeah, well, look, there's no question those images, the footage coming out of Ukraine is abhorrent, awful to look at, but yeah, somehow also the cruel reality of things that happen during war that my heart just goes out to the families who have lost people, and especially having these images. Imagine if that was your brother, your father, your uncle. It is heartbreaking.
Yeah.
As a lawyer with my lawyer's hat on, so it's clear, I would say, from these images that crimes have been committed. We say often allegedly to I don't know what language I can use it to cover our backsides. So to say to cover
You can use whatever language you want,
can I say that?
Yeah, totally.
And that's because, everyone is innocent until proven guilty. Even the worst war criminals deserve their day in court. They deserve a proper defense in the way that the legal system works. So allegedly war crimes have been committed. But the other reason is because it can be so hard. If we think about it this way, it's clear that something terrible has happened. But exactly who did it and why, those are the questions that are say if it went to an international criminal tribunal, like the International Criminal Tribunal in The Hague. So that's a tribunal that is kind of world court for dealing with these war crimes, but also crimes against humanity, genocide, and a crime of aggression. It's complicated. We can come back to that. So the thing is that even if you can see that, for example, if you had evidence that someone has been executed, someone who was in the hands of the enemy and was executed, even if you knew that, this International Criminal Court usually tries what they call the big fish, right? They're going for the higher up leaders. They're not dealing with all the foot soldiers. So you might know that a particular, even if you knew, that might already be difficult, even if you knew a particular unit or a particular group of soldiers from a particular unit did these murders, you're still actually trying to sort of find a link to pin it back to people that have command responsibility for those troops, right? So ultimately even to Putin, for example.
Yeah.
And that becomes quite difficult then. How can you prove? So yes, on the one hand, someone might be the, ultimate commander of the military forces as the president. But how do you prove that was that an order that was given to the troops to act like that? Was it some kind of negligence, that they weren't trained properly, or there was a culture where that was accepted or encouraged, or was it a lower down leader, or was it that just that particular unit that went rogue somehow? So that's the difficulty. And if you think, in a criminal trial, those things have to be proven to a high criminal standard, that can sometimes be the challenge.
So what I hear you saying as well is it's obvious a crime has been committed, but we don't know the hows, the whys, the whens yet. We can infer based on what we've been told, witness testimony, but actually that's to be decided. And I wonder if that's why I think the Prime Minister here was getting a bit of criticism for refusing to say Putin was a war criminal, whereas someone like the leader of the opposition, Mr. Luxon, who has no responsibility really, because he's never going to be called upon being accountable for his words yet, because he's the leader of the opposition, can say what he wants. So he comes out saying, yes, war criminal, whereas the PM, who is actually an international diplomat, has to be a bit more careful based on kind of what you're saying.
I mean, for me, the images that are coming out clearly suggest serious violations of this Geneva Convention's law, and serious violations of that law are war crimes. But yeah, as I said, to be completely correct, we cover our ass by saying allegedly, or someone is accused of war crimes, that have not yet been found guilty of war crimes, therefore not a war criminal in the legal sense. Yeah.
Yes. And also, it's not just what we're seeing as well. Let me bring up this article here. We're hearing from other groups who aren't. I need to pull that over there because that's where my notes are. Who aren't actually the Human Rights Watch said on Sunday that it found several cases of Russian military forces committing laws of war violations in Russian-controlled regions such as Chernihiv and Kiev and Kharkiv, I think it is. So others are also looking in from the outside saying, yes, war crimes happening here. So I guess the question is, what happens next? I mean, what's the next step if the international community is looking in going, they're committing war crimes? What does the international community do?
Yeah, so actually the International Criminal Court, which is this court that sits in The Hague, they've been monitoring and investigating the situation in Ukraine actually since about 2015.
Right.
Because there's been fighting in eastern Ukraine since 2014. The thing that complicates everything is that neither Ukraine nor Russia nor Belarus are parties to the International Criminal Court. They haven't signed up to it, or Russia might have and then withdrew. I'm getting confused. But anyway, at the moment, they're not state parties. And so the way that the court doesn't just automatically have jurisdiction to investigate in any country that it wants to. That country has to, there's various mechanisms, but one of the mechanisms is that the country has to give it permission to do so, so it has to sign up. Or in this case, in the case of Ukraine issued a declaration that gave the court jurisdiction to come and investigate things that were happening on its territory. So that's given the court the ability to investigate. And with the recent events, they've sped up their process, and they're now actively investigating allegations. And I actually just looked at online at the statement that the chief prosecutor made, Mr. Karim Khan, and it's even, they give their email address and they say anyone with any information or evidence that they would like to submit, you can contact them, and so individual people can submit things. And I think that becomes quite important because obviously in the middle of a war, it's very difficult for investigatory teams to actually have safe access and to gather that evidence that needs to be kept at a very high, like with police, that they've got a sort of chain of custody of evidence to make sure that it's not tainted, that the source is reliable and all that kind of thing. So the same high evidentiary standards apply in the International Criminal Court. But obviously a lot of this footage is coming from just normal people who live there on their phones, for example, and from journalists who are able to access the areas afterwards.
Microphone's off, George.
Apologies. Sorry. I've brought up the signatories to the International Criminal Court, and as you can see there, as Marnie said, that Russia did withdraw eventually, along with the states, which is interesting in this regard, right? Because we had Biden saying that Putin is a war criminal, which was quite full on language, right? Manu,
I think.
yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, how can we sort of look to other times where the International Criminal Court has come in to conflicts? You were saying before we started that Darfur is finally getting started, the conflict in Sudan. So what's that, like 20 years or something like that, early 2000s, the Darfur conflict? How can we sort of gauge the success rate, I guess, of a possible investigation in Ukraine by looking to other times that the International Criminal Court has done its thing?
Yeah, well, listen, I would say that the report card is mixed, right? So the International Criminal Court itself's been around for about 10 years now. They've had a number of cases related to situations in different countries in Africa, mostly, and that's also sometimes why they're criticised for working mostly on African contexts and not others. In some senses, yeah, there can be some challenges for them in terms of having jurisdiction over certain countries. So as you rightly pointed out, not all countries are parties, so including the US. The US has not signed up to the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court. And yeah, that does give a bit of a sense of hypocrisy when Biden, for example, or any US state official is calling for war crimes investigation or calling for the crime of aggression to be tried when they're not even party. That country is not party to the Rome Statute itself. I think one could easily argue that if a state really wanted to support international criminal justice and the so-called fight against impunity, one very easy step would be to sign up themselves, right? So that's one thing. But yeah, the other thing is that these things really take a long time. And what's happened in the past is before the International Criminal Court was up and running, is that separate standalone international criminal tribunals were set up, for example, by the Security Council. So there was a International Criminal Tribunal dealing with situations from the wars in the former Yugoslavia, also for the genocide in Rwanda. There's been special kind of hybrid courts that are partly national and partly international for in Cambodia, for example. So yeah, and things really can take a long time. The Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, that worked for about 20 years or so. So it's a big decision to set up a separate tribunal. The other challenge here is that because we're talking about Russia, and Russia is P5 member of the Security Council, using the Security Council, which can make binding resolutions, sort of falls off the possible menu of options, assuming that Russia would just veto anything in that sense.
I guess I was wondering as well, what's the bar? What's the level of atrocity to war crime to, off to the Hague? Because we talked last time about the Geneva Convention, and it appears to me, in my ignorant kind of take, that you don't really get war without sort of breaches of the Geneva Convention, because at some stage a hospital gets bombed or whatever. It seems that it happens all the time, yet it seems in this instance we're hearing, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't be, but we're hearing, war crimes, we're hearing the Hague, we're hearing all these words, and why don't we hear that every single time any kind of atrocity or breach of the Geneva Convention or international law or war crime actually happens?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the sad reality is that these laws are violated all the time in armed conflict. and often with no follow-up, right? No criminal procedure, no compensation for the people affected, no nothing. The way the system works, for better or worse, is that states parties to the Geneva Conventions, which is all of them, more or less all of them, when they sign up to the Geneva Conventions, they're committing to respect that law themselves, but also to ensure respect of that law by anybody else in whatever reasonable means they can use to do that, to persuade them, or to, and it's what these countries have been doing, right? You know, they're expressing outrage, they're calling for an end to the war, they're calling for prosecution. So those sorts of diplomatic statements are part of this sort of pushing for the law to be respected. But in terms of actually investigating and prosecuting crimes, the system, for better or worse, is decentralized. So it needs to rely on the states actually doing that themselves. So they actually have a duty under the Geneva Conventions that if there's allegations of war crimes that have been committed either by their own armed forces or by people on their territory, they must take all reasonable efforts to investigate and prosecute it themselves. Now, then the reality is that during the middle of a war, it's very hard for them to do that, or to do that properly. The other reality is that countries are not always willing to investigate and prosecute their own armed forces. So New Zealand has done that, for example, with the Operation Burnham inquiry. Australia has done that with the Brereton report. So countries do that, but often they're more hesitant to do that for their own troops. But the way the system is supposed to work ideally is that countries themselves would do that, and sort of for the, let's say, the lower level, for the actual troops on the ground. And the International Criminal Court is supposed to be the kind of backup shop for dealing with the most horrendous crime. So as you say, like the higher level, the worst atrocities, the most serious atrocities. It doesn't have capacity to deal with every lesser allegation, however serious those allegations actually are. So it's designed to deal with the most serious, but also the most serious that the other countries are not investigating. And that's actually a requirement before the ICC can take the case. It has to show that the country itself has not been taking appropriate action.
I mean, I was also, I'm sort of amazed that I was reading an article yesterday and I tried to find it, but I couldn't find it to bring it up in the show, but that actually how matter of fact Russia is being at the moment about around this area of Bucha, the idea of the atrocities that have happened. And then the article I was reading was like, Russia have decided to stop attacking in the northeast. They're now just going to attack primarily from the east. And I'm like, hang on, they're actually kind of going, this is what we're doing, and we are invading the sovereign land. And they're just being blatant and blunt about it. It kind of was the thing that surprised me most at all, that they're now not talking even about where freedom fighters coming in. They're like, we couldn't get incursion from the northeast very well, so we're just going to come in from the east. And it was written in a way that this is the plan and this all makes sense. And I'm like, this doesn't make any sense at all. It's a bizarre thing we look at. Marnie, look, we're going to need to leave it there because you've got things to do and we've got things to do. But as always, and I'm sure George is going to be the same, we're at the end of a conversation. We could go for another 20 or 40 minutes. So we are going to want to have you back again. And thank you very much for your perspective and insight into this, especially from your aspects of being, an expert in the law and helping us learn a bit more about what it means. Because I think a lot of people have that question, why now war crimes? Why not, X conflict or X conflict or X conflict? So it's good to understand. So Dr. Marnie Lloydd from the Faculty of Law, University of Victoria in Wellington, thank you so much for your time. We do appreciate it.
Thanks very much. Take good care.